It's funny. You can learn a whole lot about a country just by looking at its rule book. And I'm not just talking about what's in it. Sometimes it's the length of the thing that tells the real story. And we're about to see a perfect example of that. So, to really get what we're talking about, let's flip the script for a second. Let's look at the complete opposite. What do you think is in the world's longest constitution? I mean, what could you possibly write about that takes up so much space? Well, pretty much everything you can imagine. And I mean everything. We're talking about everything from state-run insurance funds to the super specific details of how a university should be governed. Seriously, it's less of a grand vision and more like a massive, sprawling instruction manual for every little thing. And when I say massive, I'm not kidding. We're talking over 75,000 words. That's longer than a lot of novels. And get this, it's been changed over 500 times. That tells you something, right? It's a document that's trying to cover every single base for every possible situation. Okay, so you have that picture in your head, the giant, detailed rulebook. Now I want you to just throw it away, because we're going to the other extreme, to Monaco, home of the shortest constitution on the entire planet. And it's not just a little shorter, it's a whole different way of thinking about how to run a country. Which, of course, leads to the big question, right? How on earth can you run a whole country with just a handful of rules? Especially today, with how complicated everything is. I mean, how does that even work? Who's really in charge, and what do you do when the rulebook just stops? All right, let's dive into it. This little document has a pretty interesting history. It wasn't just written on a whim. It came out of some really key moments that made Monaco what it is today. Yeah, so the big takeaway here is that even though it's tiny, it's not set in stone. The first one came about way back in 1911 after a revolution, people wanting to put a check on the monarch's power. Then it got a major overhaul in 1962 and another little update in 2002 about who gets to inherit the throne. Every single one of those changes was basically a negotiation over power. Okay, so before we get any deeper, let's just make sure we're on the same page. What is a constitution, really? At its heart, it's the basic rule book for a country. It sets up the government, says who has what powers, and lays out the rights of the citizens. Simple enough, right? But keeping that definition in mind is exactly why Monaco's tiny version is so weird. So let's get into the mechanics. The real genius, or maybe the real challenge of Monaco's constitution, is how it splits up the power. It's what's called a constitutional monarchy. That just means the prince isn't an all-powerful ruler. There's a balance. A very delicate balance. And look, this whole idea of putting limits on a king or queen, it's not new, not at all. People have been wrestling with this for centuries. I mean, you can go all the way back to the Magna Carta in England, which was a huge deal for this very reason. This line right here, this is the heart of it. We're talking over 800 years ago, and they were writing down that even the king has to follow the rules. It sounds simple to us now, but back then, that was revolutionary. The idea that no one, not even the monarch, is above the law. And that's exactly the principle Monaco's little constitution is built on. So how does Monaco pull this off? Well, it breaks the government down into 3 branches, which should sound pretty familiar. You've got the executive branch, that's the prince, the legislative branch, which is their parliament, the National Council, and then the judicial branch, the courts. And even though the courts hand down justice in the prince's name, they're independent. That's key. Okay, so here's a real-world example of how that power sharing works. The National Council, the elected folks, they can come up with a new law and vote on it. But it doesn't actually become a law until the prince signs off on it. It's a mandatory partnership. Neither side can make a law all by themselves. It's a check and balance system boiled down to its absolute essence. And this, for me, is where it gets really interesting. Because with a short rule book, what happens when something comes up that's not in the book? What do you do in all those gaps between the lines? This is the huge challenge, right? Remember California's giant manual? It tries to have an answer for everything. But Monaco's, it has to rely on interpretation. So the question becomes, who gets to be the interpreter? And how do they make those calls? To kind of wrap our heads around this, let's look at a different country for a second. Japan. Their constitution has this famous part, Article 9, that basically says Japan gives up the right to wage war. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But then, Japan has a very modern, very capable military. So, what gives? The answer is all about interpretation. When this was challenged in court, Japan's Supreme Court basically said, you know what? This is a political question. It's something for the elected politicians to figure out, not us judges. It's a way for the courts to sidestep really thorny political issues. And that brings us right back to Monaco. With so many built-in gray areas in its constitution, you have to wonder, how does their Supreme Court handle this? When do they jump in and make a ruling, and when do they say, nope, that's for the politicians to decide? Well, in Monaco, the Constitution gives the Supreme Court a really clear, really important job. Interpret the Constitution whenever it's necessary. That little phrase makes the court super powerful. It becomes the ultimate referee, the one who decides what the rules actually mean. Think about that. They're taking these broad ideas from decades ago and applying them to problems the original writers couldn't have even dreamed of. So, when you get right down to it, this is all about two totally different philosophies. What's a constitution supposed to be? Is it a super detailed blueprint, or is it more like a set of guiding stars? And this chart lays out the pros and cons perfectly. On one hand, you have the detailed rulebook. The good part? It's clear. The bad part? It can get outdated and clunky real fast. Then you have Monaco's approach, a guiding framework. The upside is huge flexibility. The downside? It can be vague. And that means you're putting a massive amount of trust and power into the hands of the people who have to interpret it. So that leaves us with one last question to chew on. If it were up to you, what would you choose? Would you build a fortress of rules, trying to plan for every single possibility? Or would you plant a single, sturdy tree, a core set of beliefs, and trust that future generations can care for it and help it grow? Monaco, well, they chose the tree. And that one choice has made all the difference.